So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all on Treaty 1 territory, the land, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dene, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And that we acknowledge the past and continuous acts of colonization that are taking place within our country, and that we are dedicated towards addressing them and repairing that relationship and honoring the treaties. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. My name is Brianne Lamrou. I am the volunteer coordinator for David Nickarz. It's a pleasure to work with him in this election, and I'm so happy to see you all here tonight. Before I introduce Dave, I'd just like to mention that if you do need bathrooms, they are just to the side right there. As most of you have already seen, there's food and snacks near the entrance. And we also have a sign-up table there, so if any of you are feeling inspired after this night and would like to volunteer in our campaign, there are plenty of sheets over there, and I will call you in the next week or so. There's also buttons and lawn signs that you can take home with you. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to invite David Nickarz up here.
Thanks, Brianne. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming. Welcome to an evening with Elizabeth May and the Green Party of Manitoba. Thank you all for coming. And thank you to Olga, who helped us get this space tonight. And you are in the West End Commons. This is a wonderful space. Not only is it a room to meet and talk like we're doing now, but there is rental housing for families in this space, most of which is rent geared to income. And there's also 6 accessible units, a social enterprise, and a community center. So thank you to the hosts here. So since this is a Green Party of Manitoba event, I want to send James's regrets. James Bedham is the leader of the Green Party of Manitoba. He is attending the forum put on by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs called I'm First Nations and I Vote. So he's going to be speaking at that forum right now. So that's why he's not here with us. I'm here to introduce Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party of Canada. I first met Elizabeth in 2002 at the International Forestry Forum in Quebec City. And I've seen her speak several times on many occasions. And she was kind enough to come by Manitoba in 2016. And she visited my election campaign as well, where I came pretty close to winning the first Green seat in Manitoba political history. It was 5%. And among other things, we're going to certainly have a question and answer period, but she's here again to speak to you all about why we need more Greens elected in Parliament and in legislatures across Canada. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. This event would be nothing without you taking time out of a very beautiful August evening, and I really appreciate it. We're here for an important reason, and that is that this election actually matters a lot on many different levels. The election here in Manitoba and the election that will follow federally. I don't know that I've ever seen a time that we've had 2 such important elections back to back. It is quite extraordinary. I don't know if you counted up your days, 26 days till Manitobans go to the polls, 67 days till Canadians go to the polls. We have an enormous challenge in front of us, and I don't speak of an enormous challenge because I'm leader of the Green Party. I speak of the enormous challenge because I identify myself as an earthling. I am a Canadian. I love Turtle Island. This is where I live. I love Vancouver Island where I live and Cape Breton Island where I used to live. But I think we have to start identifying ourselves as people who love Mother Earth and recognize that in these 2 elections, 26 days from now and 67 days from now, we have an opportunity that will never again come our way. So let me tell you why I feel that way, but I also want to acknowledge that in this room, besides our wonderful future MLA for Wolseley, in addition to Dave Nickarz here, we also have, who was addressing us earlier, Brianne, I think it's the same Brianne Lamoureux is running in Seine River. Tony Hill running in Selkirk. Tony, where are you? There. Sarah Campbell in Fort White. Oh, hello. Jeff Booz in St. James. I apologize if I pronounced your last name wrong. Jeff? That was Jeff Boozy, I'm informed. I apologize for the schlim. Roger Schellenberg in Riel. Andrea Chalet in Union. Andrea, there you are. There. Nick Geddert in Elmwood. Nick. And believe it or not, we also have federal candidates in the room. Ben Linnick running in San Boniface. Andrea running again federally. Anybody else in the room that I don't know about is also running federally that I've lost track of? Because James Badam was going to be running federally, but as a recently elected MLA, he will probably not run federally. I think it's a safe bet. But right now, I mean, that's how unusual this is. That we have, thanks to, I mean, politics is so depressing. The cynicism of your premier to decide in January, let's get everyone all psyched for the fact I'm going to call an election when it's convenient. I'll get them all used to it in January that they're not voting in 2020, they're going to vote sometime in 2019, and I'll launch a lot of blue balloons, and that'll confuse them. I find the cynicism of this election call actually jaw-dropping, that the election was called, as we know, this week, for a vote in 26 days. It's one of the shortest writ periods of any province I've ever seen. And clearly the intention of Brian Palliser is to form power again with the minimum amount of time that the voters of this province would be able to examine his record, talk to the candidates, talk to the other parties, and consider what is in the best interest of this province. It's a fast election for a reason, and that's why it of course defies the purpose of the fixed election date laws that exist in this province just as they exist federally. So it's one of those moments where it washes over me how much I dislike politics. By the way, before I finish with talking about the candidates, I meant to mention something else. It really will matter, in my view. I mean, I'm a federal cousin. I'm not really part of the Green Party of Manitoba, except that I'm a federal cousin. But it really matters to have a full slate. We're really close right now. So if any of you are willing to even consider saying, I'll be what we call a paper candidate. I can't get up to wherever we have a riding, electoral district, whatever we call them in what do we call them in
I think it's multiple, but riding is...
riding, I still call them ridings. I'm old-fashioned. But in any case, there are places where, for instance, the name Andrew Park on the ballot would be fantastic. I would travel far to vote for Andrew Park. I'm still trying to get him to run green again federally. But it would be, please consider it. It's something that most people don't consider, how much you can help the party and the movement, and I'm going to speak to the movement in a minute, by making sure that James Badam, who's doing such a fantastic job as leader of this party, has the ability to be in the leaders' debates and not be vulnerable because we're short a few ridings. It really is helpful. We do it federally, goodness knows. Every election, the Greens federally have had full slates since 2004. And yeah, but sometimes, and all the parties do this, sometimes there's a candidate whose name is on the ballot, but who's never visited that riding. sometimes those candidates can get elected. It actually happened, right? In 2011, the NDP Orange Crush in Quebec elected candidates, one who's a very good friend of mine, and she's turned into a very capable member of Parliament, Ruth Ellen Brazeau, she was a bartender at the university pub at Carleton University in Ottawa. And one of her friends in the NDP said, "Your name, Brazeau, it sounds French. Do you speak French?" She said, "No." I said, "Well, would you mind if we ran you in Quebec as a paper candidate?" And she said, "Okay, but I've already got my vacation planned to Las Vegas." Right? You know this story. She got elected. And she's done a terrific job. And Ruth Ellen is a single mom, elected as an MP, and threw herself at the job. But that's called being a paper candidate. It's pretty rare to be elected in a riding that you've never visited. In her whole life, she'd never set foot in the riding that she now represents, and where she was handily re-elected in 2015 because her constituents love her. She's done a terrific job. But there's no shame, in other words, in saying, "I'll put my name on the ballot, but I can't do anything for you." You don't have to take a vacation in Las Vegas for this to apply to you as a possibility. But just let it circulate, let it foment a bit in your head. It would be a big help to the party. So why is this such a critical election? Well, for Manitoba and for Canada, there's one answer. And I hope that this doesn't put me in a pigeonhole of one-issue party, because we're not a one-issue party. I plan to go into the federal election fighting for pharmacare, fighting to eliminate poverty. We have a range of social justice issues that are pressing. We will be fighting to ensure that we have a fairer shake for young people by eliminating tuition and getting rid of student debt. We will address the affordability crisis that affects most of Canada. The transportation crisis, I just finished, I was here last. I don't know how many of you came to the theater in Winnipeg. We were about 400 people there for an event just before St. Patrick's Day in March, and it was amazing. Well, I did 32 communities with that approach of a few words up front, open the floor, answer questions, have a great evening. Communities big and small, from communities of as few as 1,000 people to downtown Calgary. Right across the country, we held these Community Matters Tours meetings. And one of the things we discovered by going across the country, and it really did inform our platform, was that right across the country, there's a national crisis in transportation, but because it's experienced locally, people don't know it's a national crisis. So when I'd be holding these kinds of Community Matters Tour meetings in northern British Columbia, people would say, "Well, we've lost Greyhound." But then we were doing low carbon travel for the whole tour, so I was mostly on trains and buses where we could find them, and volunteers in their electric cars. But when we were in Saskatchewan, they said, "Oh, we've had a really bad blow. We've lost our bus service." In Atlantic Canada, we've lost our bus service. So here we are, a modern industrialized country where we lack the basic public transit of, say, Mexico or Venezuela, where if you walk to the bottom of a country lane and wait, a bus will come. You can wait a very long time to try to get from Prince George to Vancouver. There's no bus. And it increases, as the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women pointed out, because all these issues tend to get connected one to the other, that the lack of accessible bus service, affordable transit, is a very large cause of vulnerability for Indigenous women who, if they're going to travel, end up having to hitchhike. This is not safe. We're a modern industrialized country. We should be able to have proper transit. So these things all informed our platform. And they do interconnect, right? The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry also called for guaranteed livable income, which is one of our core policies to eliminate poverty, and one that is very parallel to the approach of the Green Party of Manitoba and how we eliminate poverty. But I was going to say, in terms of deadlines and why these two elections rise up above, there are always critical issues in elections. If you go back to the 1960s, before we had health care, that election really mattered. It mattered that there was a minority parliament in the late 1960s. It mattered that Lester B. Pearson as Liberal Prime Minister in a minority parliament, was willing to work across party lines, and that the 17 New Democrats in that parliament were willing to work across party lines. They no longer are, sadly, but then they did. And it was Tommy Douglas and David Lewis working with Lester B. Pearson, which is why that election really mattered, because that delivered to us in a minority parliament our healthcare system and the Canada Pension Plan and unemployment insurance and, student loans without any interest payments, and for good measure, the flag. So that was a stellar parliament. But it's rare, thank God it's rare, that an election actually has in the balance the survival of life on Earth. So if I'm going to be pegged with being a leader who's particularly worried about one issue, it's not bad when survival's the issue. I mean, you can't really get around the reality that what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told the world in their special report that came out October 8th of last year, we were told very clearly, we have one chance only to ensure that we can continue human civilization on this planet past the lifetimes of our own children. Not intergenerationally, not think 200 years down the road, people could be in trouble. 60 years. 50? We're not sure. It's a roll of the dice. We know one thing for certain, which is that we have to hold global average temperature to no more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase over what it was before the Industrial Revolution. Very hard concept and a mouthful of words for one simple reality. This is a matter of life and death. And we don't get a do-over. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told the world last fall that the Paris Agreement, which says everybody who signed on to it, which currently is still every country on Earth, announcements that Trump made in the Rose Garden notwithstanding, the US has not left the Paris Agreement. So every country on Earth is committed on paper to ensuring that global average temperature increase holds to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius and stays, this is the wiggle room, stays as far below 2 degrees as possible. So a little bit of context, because I know this is just mind-bendingly depressing sometimes, or also just eyes glaze over because the figures are so hard to really grapple with. But what happened at the Paris negotiations was that having come up with the commitment in the text of the treaty, and these are the Paris targets, the text of the treaty is the Paris targets, to hold global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees and as far below 2 degrees as possible. All the nations that were then at that negotiating session in December 2015 passed another document called a COP21 decision document that said, we really need good scientific advice here because we've said we want to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at least as far below 2 as possible. But we even know that that's possible anymore because our emissions have risen so rapidly. And do we know, as policymakers, heads of governments, et cetera, what's the difference in impacts between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was created actually with a lot of Canadian leadership back in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was asked to answer those questions. What's the difference between 1.5 and 2? And is it still possible to hold to 1.5, or is 2 degrees or more pretty much inevitable? Backing up a little bit, when we went into the Paris negotiations right after our last election in 2015, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had already done some number crunching because for those of you who really follow these things, and I'm sorry getting so much detail, but in Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol actually had the targets of each country baked into the treaty. So Canada's target was part of the Kyoto Protocol. What they did for Paris was decide, okay, that didn't work so well. So let's say the targets get tabled with the UN Secretariat on Climate that resides in Bonn, Germany, and any country at any time can pull their target back, bring in a new target anytime, but only if they ratchet up and it becomes more ambitious. So that's how when we went into the Paris negotiations, some of you may remember the media coverage, that everyone knew, because the numbers had been crunched, that if every country on Earth kept its promises for the targets they had tabled in Bonn, the effect would be global average temperature increase of 2.5 to 3.4 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So there we are in Paris negotiating that will hold to 1.5. Sort of cognitive dissonance going on, but you're saying, well, wait, we know we should hold to 1.5, so let's be ambitious and put that in the treaty. At the same time, the collectivity of all the targets that had been put in place took us to twice that, more than twice that. So that's why the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was asked to give the advice. What's the difference between 1.5 and 2? Can we still hold to 1.5, or is it too late? And is 2 degrees kind of a safe, cozy place to land? So what we now know is that we have to hold to 1.5. The difference in impacts between 1.5 and 2 is much more severe than people had thought even at Paris. 2 degrees Celsius is not a safe place at all. It's at that zone of rolling the dice on whether we move towards an uninhabitable biosphere for anything. I don't like to talk about that one. Or where we just lose human civilization but hang on elsewhere in pockets of some kind of existence. In other words, it's essential that we hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm going to back up another time. So I keep digressing from my digressions, but I think some scientific context is needed. Because in a place like Winnipeg, where goodness only knows, I mean, Winnipeg's the only place I've ever visited when I stay with friends, starting like 30 years ago when I first started coming to Winnipeg in the winter. And friends would say, whatever you do, don't approach the doorknob with your mittens off, right? I never had health and safety advice for reaching for a doorknob till I visited friends in Winnipeg. So it gets brutally cold, minus 35 in the winter, minus 40 maybe? And it can go up to plus 35 in the summer or more. So when I'm talking about 1.5, I'm always aware that it doesn't sound like much. But it's not 1.5 degrees in kind of an abstract. It's 1.5 degrees global average temperature increase for the whole planet. So the difference, just for a point of reference, between the average global temperature now and the average global temperature when we were under several kilometers of ice 10,000 years ago in the last ice age, the difference is 5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase. So it's a 5 degrees global average temperature is the difference between now and several kilometers of ice and an ice age. So it's a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature is huge. We're already at 1 degree. We're looking at, can we hold it to no more than another 50% jump on that, 1.5 degrees Celsius? And fortunately, the IPCC said, based on technology, economics, science, physics, all the things that are essential to be able to say we can do it, we can do it. We can, as a global society, hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase and not go above that. But as the IPCC also said, it will be very difficult. It will require an entire transformation of every country's economy. It will require that all sectors participate. It is all hands on deck. That's why we released ahead of the election, because we knew a lot of Green New Deal workshops were happening across the country. We wanted to give people a sense of where should we be going. So Canada's so-called, this is so frustrating that the media still calls it Canada's Paris target, but as you can imagine, one of those targets that's completely inadequate, that was tabled with the UN before we negotiated the Paris Agreement to hold to 1.5 degrees, was of course Canada's target. And Canada's target that was put in place 6 months before we negotiated the Paris Agreement, put in place by political watchers and trivia fanciers will remember, maybe, the last environment minister under Stephen Harper, Leona Aglukkaq. Leona Aglukkaq tabled Canada's target in May 2015 when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. And that target was 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Representing the third time that the Harper administration had weakened our target from when they took office. So this is the weakest of the Harper targets, And when it was put in place, opposition parties, including the Liberals, said that's so weak. That is embarrassing. That's a terrible target. And in Paris, at the negotiations there, Catherine McKenna, incoming Minister of Environment and Climate Change, said to the media and everybody, it's not like I'm the only one who should remember this, but anyway, it was all, she said, Canada's current target is very weak, it's unacceptable, it is the floor, and we will do better. So, I don't really need a spoiler alert to tell you that that's still our target. Right? We did not improve on the target put in place under Stephen Harper, and it's 4 years later, with all the opportunities where we should have shown some leadership globally. It's hard to show leadership when we're still in the laggard category of countries from around the world. So we need to have a target that is consistent with what we committed to do. The idea that there's a Paris target for Canada, and by the way, the Liberals are not on track to meet the target left behind by Harper. They're falling short of it. The whole debate in this country has been about carbon pricing, and I'm hoping it comes up in discussions because I really want to have a good conversation with all of you and not just rant. But that seems to be all we talk about. And carbon pricing, you could design a perfectly credible climate plan without carbon pricing. We're for it as Greens, but it doesn't get you very far at all. It's like saying, if John F. Kennedy had tried to inspire the United States by saying, we're going to put a man on the moon, and our first step is, can you bring out that step ladder now? I want everyone to see. Our first step is we're going to get to 8 feet. That's kind of where carbon pricing is in the mission to avoid global climate catastrophe. So we called our policy Mission Possible, both because I'm kind of an old fan of dum, 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 dum. But also, it is possible. We want to stress that it's possible. But it certainly isn't mission easy. It's hard. It's going to be hard, but it's also going to be inspiring, fulfilling, engaging, mobilizing, unifying. Because what we really need to do to confront our addiction to fossil fuels and the threat of the climate crisis is to put ourselves on something quite like the kind of response of governments facing an existential threat like a foreign enemy. And we don't face a foreign enemy, so that's good. But we do face an existential threat, just as much a threat to our survival as Earthlings as Winston Churchill faced as a threat to the survival of the British Isles as an independent nation not under Nazi occupation. Exactly that kind of threat. We're trying to imagine how you're going to avoid Nazi occupation in May 1940 was mind-bogglingly difficult, because the evidence that Winston Churchill had to assess is, if anything, more dispiriting than the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change analysis of how we have to avoid going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. I could walk through it because I find that 1 week in May 1940 where Churchill nearly surrendered to Hitler, and I think some of you have probably seen that movie, The Darkest Hour, but I've been reading the history of that period. It's just extraordinary how close they were to surrender because they had no assets. They had no resources that they could marshal. Their entire army was at that moment, I'll do a quick summary, their entire army, over 200,000 men, was pinned down on the beach in France, in northern France at Dunkirk. Pinned down. It wasn't just a couple of battalions, it was the entire army. And any hope of help from the French government disappeared when, in that same period, that same week, France surrendered, as had Poland, as had Netherlands. Every time Hitler's army marched into a country, they surrendered. So they had the armies pinned down. They can't get the famous British Navy to rescue their soldiers because the beaches are too shallow. There's no depth for the Navy to get in there and rescue. The Luftwaffe's overhead. Okay, there's no defenses on the coastlines of England. The coastlines have nothing. So if they don't somehow miraculously rescue their soldiers and the equipment from Dunkirk, they're just sitting ducks. They have absolutely no perimeter defenses against an invading army. So in that context, the one last hope they had was that the United States might come in and help them. And as I'm sure you all remember, the United States did not come into the war until after Pearl Harbor and did not offer to send Churchill any help at all. So in that kind of setting, when I think sometimes about how dispiriting it is, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room, and you're here tonight because you're concerned about this and you know how dangerous it is, will be thinking it really looks so bleak, I don't know where I'm going to find hope. So that's why I return to this period a lot in my head, because it's important to hang on to hope, and it's important to, I know it's a hackneyed phrase to think outside the box, but I still can't find out, even though I've read a number of books on this period, I can't figure out how Churchill got the idea that when his senior military was telling him what I just told you, and political enemies and allies and the senior bureaucracy and just about everybody was telling him, our best bet here is to get that nice Mr. Mussolini to speak to Herr Hitler on our behalf and cut a good deal. Somehow, miraculously, it occurred to Winston Churchill to ask, how many civilian boats are there in Dover? Now that's right off the charts. It's not, the military has toted up their assets. They've looked at, the strategy and well, how many civilian boats are there in Dover? That question is what stopped Hitler, right? That one question, because there were 863 civilian boats in Dover. That's what there was. And here's a government prepared to say, our Navy can't help us, our Army's pinned down, but we're going to ask a bunch of volunteers to get in their little boats and cross the English Channel and start rescuing 200,000 men in 863 fishing boats, recreational boats, ferries. It's, when you think about it, we know what happened because we're here and we all have read history, but my dad grew up in London through the Blitz, so I kind of, oral history gets you more, and the longer our generations are from the experience of the Second World War, the more the historical record is going to be as removed from our kids now as Culloden is when I was growing up. But this is for me powerful stuff. That what saved us, and I do think it included all of us, was 863 vessels captained by volunteers who went across the English Channel. And one more little additional bit of, you can call it good luck or miracle, there was heavy cloud cover. So Luftwaffe couldn't see the boats. And they lost about 100 boats and 1,000 lives. And they rescued not only the 200,000 British soldiers pinned down in Dunkirk, for good measure, they rescued 20,000 more French. Now that, to me, I try to do the math in my head here. How the heck did they do that? So now with Mission Possible, we've launched this vision that, okay, we have to reduce greenhouse gases in Canada by 60% below what they were in 2005, and we have to do it by 2030. And that is, in fact, exactly double the current Harper-Trudeau-Scheer target, exactly double, and substantially more than anything that Jagmeet Singh has suggested. And I get faced with the questions, well, show us the numbers. How's that going to work exactly? Well, we've crunched the numbers. We've shown how it can work. But people keep coming up with objections. I'm thinking, if Winston Churchill had to try to cost out the Second World War before getting approval to fight Hitler, we'd all be speaking German. Not that there's anything wrong speaking German. I love my friends in the German Greens. I'm just saying. So when we go back over this, it strikes me forcefully how, that right now, Canadian voters have a chance to do something amazing. Manitoba voters have a chance to tilt the entire federal election towards climate action by electing Greens in this province. That's why I'm here, because I want to beg you to help. Electing Greens, electing Dave Nickarz, electing James Badam, electing Sarah Campbell, electing Brianne. No, these are long shots once we get past Dave and James. I know that. But electing Greens in Manitoba will send shockwaves through the political class across Canada. Because the assumption has been, the first assumption when I got elected in 2011 was, that was a fluke and it will never happen again. And people on Vancouver Island must be, flaky granola kind of nuts. And then the next Green elected was, by the way, a Nobel Prize winning climate scientist next door to me who became the first Green MLA at a provincial level elected Andrew Weaver. And then the next Green elected was all, but they could still say, it's just British Columbia. We know about them. But then the next Green elected was David Coon, the leader of the Green Party of New Brunswick. And then we go back and we have an election in BC, and we have an election in PEI that elects Peter Bevan Baker, and then a by-election in PEI that elects Hannah Bell, and then we get a caucus in New Brunswick, and then we get Mike Schreiner in, and then we get official opposition in Prince Edward Island. And now I have reporters saying to me, can you explain what would be the common denominator between voters on Vancouver Island and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and Ontario? I said, I don't know, but I think it's that they're Canadian. So Greens can now be elected in Canada, and I know that for the issues that matter locally here, it matters to have better representation than what you've got. I know that. And I know Dave will work hard. I know James will work hard. They will make a difference in the Manitoba Ledge, just as David Coon has made a difference in New Brunswick. I shouldn't tell you, reporters don't like being quoted, so I won't tell you which reporter it was, but I was sitting down for an interview with a quite serious journalist in New Brunswick, not long after David Coon became the first elected Green in New Brunswick. And the way this journalist put it to me was, yeah, we really needed an integrity transfusion into our legislature. So there's something about Greens being elected 1, 2, 3, 4, I like to dream, 160, that make a really big difference. So speaking of climate change, I know the room is getting warm. I don't want to keep you before opening it up to questions. I just want to ask you from the bottom of my heart to think about this election as do or die, with the emphasis on do, and the emphasis on hope, and the emphasis on saying, you know, between now and September 10th, I don't think there's anything more important for me to do than talk to absolutely everyone I meet and ask if they've thought about voting Green. And I mean everyone. The young woman who's filling your coffee cup for the second refill. The people in the store lineup who are the checkout, young people mostly. Some of them haven't voted. I talk to them all the time and ask, do you know there's an election? Do you vote? And quite often they say, well, yeah, I know you're not going to want to talk to me. I never vote. I talk to them. We need everyone to vote provincially. We need everyone to vote federally. And we need people to vote as though their life depended on it, because it just might. Thank you. Thank you. Merci. Thank you.
Hi there. Yeah, I actually just got back from Germany last week, of all places. And one of the things I did notice is that even in the smallest of towns, every single one seemed to have extensive public transit in almost every city that I went to in town along the way. And I was just wondering what the Greens' policy is about restoring passenger rail services and public transit, rail-based public transit throughout Western Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you. And by the way, I didn't get your name.
My name is Phil.
Phil, great question. I'm very excited about our platform. I can't wait to launch it. I will tell you, by the way, I'm skipping from provincial to federal a bit to say our federal Green Party platform is currently in front of the Parliamentary Budget Office. Our budget is being costed and verified before we release it. So I'm not going to tell you how much money we're going to throw at Via Rail, but here's our basic vision. That Via Rail needs more of its own track. I travel by rail enough to know that, to give a local example, just north of Brandon, there's a place where there's a siding where passenger rail goes to wait as much as 8 hours because freight owns the track, and there's certain pinch points where if we just built 10 kilometers of track to avoid the pinch point so that freight doesn't have to worry about passenger rail, but passengers don't have to wait forever to be able to get from A to B. So we need to invest in our rail, build more track, restore Via Rail service to and electrify Via Rail, and have a train service that isn't really adorable and antique. My daughter is currently on Via Rail from Toronto back to Vancouver. She got herself a Via Rail pass this summer. We travel on the train more than most average people, but we also recognize how inadequate the service is. The train from Vancouver only goes once every 4 days. The train from Montreal to Halifax goes once every 4 days. You have a service like that, it doesn't take long for people who have to travel to decide Via Rail isn't an option. So we're going to restore Via Rail and expand it, and also run some high-speed rail in between Montreal and Toronto. And the other place where it's obvious and will pay for itself right away is between Calgary and Edmonton. But try to keep building up high-speed, electrified Via Rail, better service, and then that is like the backbone. And then there's synapses and outreach. So we'd have light rail and high-quality electric bus service, so that rural and remote parts of this country are not abandoned. Right? It's really horrifying, and particularly for seniors. And as I said, when I was in New Brunswick, people were talking about, well, we have specialized hospitals now, and if you live in Bathurst and you have to go to the doctor in Moncton, and icy roads and winter and seniors, you've got no way to get there unless you drive. And you're virtually taking your life in your hands to take some of those roads. So anyway, it's a big part of our platform. And of course, inner city transit is also very important. Electrified buses, better light rail, but it can go in sort of the major notion of a significant spinal column of Via Rail, and then branching out from that with light rail, bus service, and basically a modern transit system such as you just experienced in Germany. And we can afford it. At least that's what I'm hoping the Parliamentary Budget Office will tell us, because we've done a really good job finding revenue in some other places.
Similarly, in Manitoba, the Green Party wants to restore intercity bus service, and of course that would go a long way with the federal platform. So thanks for that question.
I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work you did on Bill S-203.
Oh, thank you.
Something that I spent a lot of time
Thanks for your
and watching the
help.
live feeds and everything.
Well, just if anyone doesn't know, that was our bill that we got passed at the end of June to keep to end the practice of keeping cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises in captivity. So no more swimming pools for whales in this country. Yeah.
But my question is, some scientists say it's the second leading cause. Some people say it's the third leading cause of greenhouse gases, and that's animal agriculture. The federal government subsidizes millions upon millions of dollars towards a dying industry that creates greenhouse gases. I personally would like to see some of that money, or most of that money, actually my dream would be all of that money, put toward plant-based agriculture, which does not create as much greenhouse gases.
Right.
What is your federal position on that?
Thank you. And we have some very up-to-date information from, you probably noticed, and thanks for the question, from the another Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report dealing with land and land use. So we now know the actual figures of the contribution of animal agriculture to climate crisis. It's 25% globally. Now, because that's primarily the removal of forests in the tropics to make room for animal agriculture, in Canada, it's still substantial. I mean, I'm not going to minimize it. In Canada, the contribution is 8%. So our policy platform looks at saying, well, of course, subsidies to fossil fuels are much larger when you're looking at subsidies to the oil sands, subsidies to fracking, subsidies to LNG, which somehow governments have decided aren't fossil fuels. It's very strange that they refer to natural gas, especially when it's fracked, because fracked gas has the same carbon footprint as coal. Anyway, and there are subsidies to animal agriculture. We're going to be, of course, calling for more plant-based diet. We're going to be calling for having more land available for plants. We're not calling for the end of meat production, but it's very likely, this hasn't 100% been checked off in the platform yet, but I think it's very likely we'll be calling for the end of industrialized feedlot operations, which has approximate cause here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, the crisis in Lake Winnipeg of these extremely dangerous toxic algal blooms are a lot related to way back when Gary Dewar decided that he wouldn't let municipalities have the right to say, we're passing a bylaw and you can't put a mega hog barn in here. So local governments should have the right to protect local water sources. In any case, it's that méga porcherie, le problème de méga porcherie, c'est vraiment énorme. C'est une source de pollution tellement sérieuse. So there's a lot of aspects to animal agriculture, but the large industrial feedlot operations also contribute to the concentration of ownership in large slaughterhouses. And we really believe strongly as Greens that farmers should be able to raise their own livestock, slaughter it, to standards that mean they're, we didn't have people dying in droves from local agriculture in the past, but local, provincial and agriculture departments have gone nuts over regulation, and we tend in this country to over-regulate. I'll shorten this up because someone's waiting. We over-regulate small business, and we allow any big transnational to walk away from any number of messes and regulations they've ignored. So it's not that we're against regulation, but we think that small business is over-regulated, and there's never a better example of that than how small farmers are treated in terms of Farmgate. We want to support and expand local agriculture, which includes local meat of all kinds, but we want to cut down greenhouse gases by not promoting an agricultural model that is overwhelmingly for export of stuff that resembles food. Yeah. Do you want to add?
I do want to add. I'll just lean over because it's easier that way. Yes, and it brings it back to evidence-based decision making. I mean, the most obvious example of that is the climate crisis. You can't negotiate with the atmosphere, I think is a famous meme that's just gone around with you on it. It's the same thing. We have to identify the real sources of greenhouse gases, such as animal agriculture, such as stationary heating. Vehicles are one of the biggest ones in Manitoba, and we have to reduce that. We can't horse trade away the carbon credits because we have a boreal forest over here, and we can't, offset them with some other thing. We have to go after them individually. So it's not an easy thing to say, but you can't negotiate with the atmosphere, and you actually have to identify where things are coming from. So that speaks to our policy. Our policy, we try to cost our policy here in the Green Party of Manitoba as well. We're slowly releasing the costed versions of them. And I encourage you to read our policy and platform at greenparty.mb.ca.
Thanks. This is Scott. Hi.
Hi. I know sometimes politics is about making a noise, about making an impression. The United States, of course, they're trying to make an impression or discuss things about people moving north from Central America. Have you heard anything about making room for 20 million Americans in Canada? And would it be worth pointing that out, that there is already speculating going on, land speculations?
Well, I haven't heard specifically about 20 million Americans coming to Canada, but I can tell you we need more immigration in this country. Our aging demographic means we don't have workforce. We have skills shortages all over the place. And we have to redefine refugees around the world. We have to redefine what we mean by refugee to include climate refugees. And we're going to we should be accepting, I know this is going to be hard for some people to imagine, but even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, global average temperature increase, there will be millions of environmental refugees every year. If we go to 2 degrees, it's hundreds of millions of environmental climate refugees every year. And we're going to be accepting people. We have to plan ahead, and we have to think about how do we ensure that whether they're 20 million Americans getting away from their government, or, the people from Central America and the way they're being treated at the border in the United States is deeply, I have to say, it's not just disturbing. It really shakes your faith in whether democracy can hold out south of the border. What on earth allows the President of the United States to continually call for people to take, to get rid of speaking of immigrants as subhuman, and then express, oh, it's terrible if someone just shot them? I mean, he's creating. I never would have imagined my whole life that there could be. I mean, I thought Bush was bad. You know, I look back on him fondly. So sorry, but don't you? I mean, isn't it awful? We thought there couldn't be anyone worse than George W. Just wait till he's gone. And then, well, those were the days. You could practically go back to. Never mind. We have to make room for people in this country, and we need to think about where. In traveling the country recently, and I also met with mayors in the 32 communities we visited, and there are a lot of mayors who would love to see increase in immigration in their community because their schools are too empty, their tax base is too little, they need workers for jobs that are there, and they don't have enough workers. So we need to figure it out, and we need to do it in a way that's compassionate and smart.
You mentioned a bit on the national inquiry about Indigenous women and girls. Are you aware that I feel that there should be a national inquiry on the foster system. There's more kids, most of them Native Indigenous-based kids,
Right.
Than there ever was in the highest period of residential schools.
I know.
And from these many more kids, by the same, whether you call it foster or residential, it's the same thing. Every year, there's thousands that go missing,
Right.
with no missing and ...
Yeah.
with no orange amber alert.
Right.
So what is your position on allowing or not allowing this to go on?
Yeah, I think we have to face the reality that we can't allow this to go on. It's true that there are now more Indigenous kids in foster care or taken from their families than there were in residential schools a generation ago, which is a shocker, right? Now, residential schools pose their own certain terrors, but so does being taken from your parents for any reason. So the key to this is one of the recommendations of the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women was that we need guaranteed livable income. Once we have a situation where no one is in poverty, because a lot of the takings of children, I was talking to an Indigenous mom the other day at an event just outside my riding, and she was talking about being basically held in hospital, not allowed to leave hospital till they could claim her child. And she hired lawyers, she tried as hard as she could, and it was all because she'd had an older child who'd had difficulties. Anyway, each story is different, each story is hard, but it's just unbearable. So it's at provincial level, of course, Child Protection Services, but the recommendation of the Inquirer on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and by the way, their first recommendation was that they want every Canadian to read the report. So I confess to you, I have not finished it yet. I am working through it. It is 1,200 pages. It is a significant report to read. I am going to get through it all before I am in any leaders' debates. It's something that it's just too heavy to travel with. But in any case, because I'm old-fashioned, I actually have to mark things up as I read them. Younger people in the room don't know what this is like. But, okay. So I'm working on it. But the best way to ensure child welfare in Canada is to eliminate poverty. And then we need to retrain and rethink all those workers who think it's their job to take children away from their parents because their parents are poor. Because that is a major cause of taking children from their parents. And I work a lot with Cindy Blackstock. There's more coming, by the way. There'll be more coming down the pipe soon from the Human Rights Tribunal. The complaints that she's lodged are moving into a next level.
Thank you for an inspiring speech, Ms. May.
Thanks.
As I see the climate crisis, it is clear to me that Canadians at all levels and in all places in the country will need to make substantive personal sacrifices in order to address the amount of energy that we're consuming, and by virtue of that, putting carbon into the atmosphere. I am wondering how the Green Party will work to keep Canadians happy, moralized, and on board with climate action in the face of the sacrifices we will all need to make to address this existential issue. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree with you, we have to make changes. I'm not sure I'd call them sacrifices. We're going to be releasing more details, but we have enormous potential to decarbonize our electricity grid quite rapidly, and then replace virtually all the current uses of fossil fuels with electricity pretty rapidly. We have barriers and obstacles in a lot of corporate lobbying and a lot of politicians, but back to, do we have the science, do we have the technology, can we pull it off? We would like, as Greens, Mission Possible calls for a major investment in our electricity grid. Now, Manitoba Hydro produces green energy, right? And you can't get Manitoba Hydro electricity into Ontario. We need some interties. The connectors need to be built. We've had an electricity system built by a series of provincial monopolistic utilities that have their own interests at heart and aren't really interested in moving to renewable energy. Because if you think about it, and I don't know how many of you look at economics, but the whole premise of utilities is that you had to centralize the production of energy so you can sell it. The world that's coming is this. Once you install your solar panels, once you have your windmills, once you have your geothermal or your tidal or whatever we're installing across the country, because there's many kinds of renewable energy, once it's there, the marginal cost of energy is zero. Sun shines, wind blows. Okay, so what happens to the utilities? They find this worrying. This is not their business model. They're not so happy about it. So we have to get our electricity utilities. Manitoba Hydro is one of the most progressive, by the way. Whenever anyone asks me who has good plans for energy efficiency, Manitoba Hydro has had good plans for energy efficiency. But we're going to have to be thinking very differently about an integrated grid that goes east-west and reaches up into Nunavut and reaches up to the Northwest Territories. We've costed it out, and it can be in place for less than the public cost, since we now own the pipeline, less than the public cost of building the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Gets all of Western Canada, including Nunavut and Northwest Territories, not all the way to Iqaluit, by the way, but a number of communities there so they can go off diesel. An enhanced, modernized electricity grid is a really important piece of Canadian infrastructure, and we can build it. Now, where are the sacrifices? Specific communities. So specific communities where they're mining coal. Specific communities where the only electricity generating station in town is the coal plant. That's why we endorsed recently all the specific findings of the task force on just transition for coal sector workers, because they're the first set of workers to experience this in terms of going off fossil fuels. But I also want to say, I love that you asked the question, how do you keep people happy? Well, I think the formula for happiness that's been derived by the economic machine, transnationals and retailers since the end of the Second World War is that people are happy when they have more stuff. And if they feel unhappy, then it's obvious they don't have enough stuff. Because ultimately, when you have enough stuff, you experience happiness. In all of this, we've kind of missed out on what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of life, being in community, having friends, having time with people you love, maybe even mobilizing in a shared purpose, like planting backyard gardens to help fight the climate crisis, like helping plant trees everywhere we can across this country, like putting on solar panels and working on low-income housing, working with Habitat for Humanity so that all the low-income housing has the very best top-notch energy efficiency and is basically free power. I mean, all of these things, I think, will make people happier, such as not waiting around as passive observers of the march towards extinction. That's not a lot of fun, really. I think we want to have fun, and saving ourselves will be a lot of fun.
It's hard to follow up anything that you say, by the way. I worked as a handyman and in construction, mostly in homes, for 20 years. And I try to tell people at the door when we talk about climate change, because the first thing you do is you hand them a green leaflet and they go, yeah, I care about the environment. So we're getting the word out as well. But I try to tell them it's not all carbon taxes and sacrifice, because the jobs required to simply insulate, and this is the most boring thing, simply insulate your home so it uses less energy right off the, did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool. That's the first thing. It's so boring. You blow dense packed cellulose in the wall. We saved $110 a month in our heating bill over at our home in West Broadway that's 118 years old. If we do that in every home that's older, we can save a lot of energy. We can retrofit other homes to the standards of Joe Ackerman. I don't know if he's in the crowd, but he did the Larson Truss 2 feet wide of dense packed cellulose added to his house, and his energy bills are extremely low. So carbon tax is just the start. The green jobs, the Green New Deal, which some of you in the room are attending those meetings. They've been going on all summer, and there's opportunity here. We can change our society, and we can come through this and survive and have a lot of good jobs and say job well done. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's opportunity here. So people need jobs. Let's put them to work saving the planet.
I think I'm going to call it the last two people. Mike, are our last two questions, because then Dave will wrap up, and we'll all be around to hang out a while. I hope we have enough ridings for all of you. You're laughing, but you're going to do so well. Sorry.
Hi, I wanted to pick up on the comment someone had made about the cetacean and captivity bill, which I also thought was fantastic. But I feel like Canada's been, I'm personally interested in animal welfare issues, and I feel like Canada's been playing around the edges because cetaceans is a very few number of animals. The changes we've made to the cruelty laws we're only addressing a small number of animals. So I was curious if the Green Party has any platforms that are more ambitious in scope, like you still test on animals, transportation laws for animals are the worst in countries.
That's right. I haven't mentioned that all of our, not all of our policies, but our foundational policy document is on our website at all times, and it's called Vision Green, and you'll find in there the rules. We basically adopt the EU rules, for instance, around the minimum size of battery cages and how animals should be transported and all that. We also want to amend the criminal code and update it so that animals aren't property, and under the criminal code we deal more harshly with cruelty to animals. And not to make it all anthropocentric, but you do get farther on your arguments when you do anthropomorphize everything. But when I talk to police chiefs and officers in law enforcement, RCMP and others, they're always really clear that the people who are sadistic with small animals are very likely to go on to be sadistic with other humans. And so we need to spot it earlier. We need to not act like animal cruelty is some sort of victimless crime. It is not victimless. There are victims, and you need to, if you can intervene with someone who's doing that in grade 5 and maybe get them some mental health treatments, maybe you save someone's life down the road. But improving our animal cruelty legislation is really important. I work a lot with Camille Labchuk at Mercer Animals, and one of the things that's cool about the S203 whale bill, even though you're right, it's very few animals. We've got a number of belugas. We're worried about them being transported out of Canada. We have to make sure we get them we're hoping to get the whales that have been in places like Marineland into sanctuary zones in the wild so they can be rehabilitated before being released. But one of the really cool aspects of S203 is it's the first piece of legislation ever in Canada where the best interests of the whale as an individual have to be considered. So if you want to export a whale from Canada and you're currently Marineland and you've got a bunch of whales, you need a permit from the Minister of Fisheries. And the Minister of Fisheries will grant the permit based on examining, is it in the best interests of the whale? Is this a good thing? And of course, we do have exemptions in S203, taking whales into captivity if you have to do something because you're rescuing an animal for rehabilitation. But it's a small group of animals, but I think it's shifted the frame, and I'm hoping it will. Yeah.
I wouldn't mind saying a few words on that. I've been an animal activist for a long time, and part of shifting that frame, as you put it, is reducing suffering. And I think people in Wolseley that I've talked to, I think as far as grasping that concept of reducing suffering, I think we should do that. And also the industries, and you mentioned, the 5-year-old child who has a propensity for, harming animals, and that could get to humans. There's also industries that are just set up for that kind of harm, and the people have to work there. So it harms the people who work there, who have to work in these intensive livestock operations and these slaughter facilities. The work pace is terrible. They treat animals of all kinds, including humans, terribly in these places. So the other aspect of that is the legal system. I mean, I know a lot less than my colleague to the left on laws, but when I worked on forestry issues, when I worked with the Sea Shepherds on international law, there is no enforcement of some of these rules. I know some of you in this room probably worked on the Animal Care Act a number of years ago, and it was a toothless piece of legislation that allowed the same abuse to continue. I know there's some nodding heads here. You probably know a lot more about this issue than I do, and I want to learn more because we need to make laws that are enforceable, that there's monitoring, and that actually get it done and don't just look good on paper.
Professor Park.
All right. Okay, so I hate to end the questions on a downer, but here I am.
Your reputation precedes you.
Yeah, so there's like 3 numbers that we need to bear in mind
Right.
for carbon reduction, right? That's 45, 11, and 50. That is, we've got to globally get emissions down by 45% over a period of 11 years in order to have a 50% chance, not a certainty, a 50% chance of keeping temperature increases at 1.5 or less. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, in Canada, we've got an infestation of Conservative premiers. It is probably on a knife's edge whether there'll be a Conservative minority in Parliament in the fall. How are we going to get these disparate political actors to come together and finally knock it through their thick skulls that we don't have to act today, we should have acted yesterday, and if we fail to act today, then we are all royally expletive deleted.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I would.
that's my question. How are you going to get them to work together? I know you love to.
I do want to get them to work together, and not to make your numbers even more of a downer, but I don't think we have 11 years. I think we have 18 months, because if you're going to get to globally, what's just the figure Andy's referencing is the IPCC said 45% reductions below 2010 levels globally in carbon dioxide. So again, carbon dioxide as opposed to our target is greenhouse gases. Some of these on dancing on heads of pins, a lot of my friends who are policy wonks get excited. But anyway, 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 is massively challenging, and that's the global target the IPCC has given us. And some of the reporters, this report came out October 8th, 2018. So they say, they look, 2018 by 2030, 18 from 30. Oh, we got 12 years. You think, well, it's like saying I'm going to go on a big diet. I'm going to lose 20 pounds. My goal is to lose it by January 1st. And every day till Christmas, I'm going to eat chocolate cake because I am going to, it doesn't work like that. If you're going to make a massive change, as you said, we had to have started yesterday. And if we had acted when we signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, if we'd done what we committed to do then, we would not have glaciers in retreat. We wouldn't be losing Arctic ice. We wouldn't be having killer heat waves. We wouldn't be having all the forest fires. We'd have the usual numbers and a bit worse, but nothing like this, because since 1992 and today, we've released more greenhouse gases than we did between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and 1992. So we have, I think, in terms of government planning horizons, 18 months to make the big turn of that wheel to get our massive super tanker with very limited mobility, to get it turned around. We have to do it within 18 months. It will be delivered by 2030, which is 11 years, but it has to start very soon. So how do we get people to work together? One of the things we've called for, back to Dunkirk in May 1940, I'm really stuck on it, we need a war cabinet. We can't call it a war cabinet, but we need the equivalent, a survival cabinet. These issues are far too important to be reduced to partisan politics and who's scoring points. The debates over carbon taxes in Parliament have been so dispiriting. I tell you, it was one debate on carbon taxes one Conservative actually said to me, well, you people in British Columbia have had carbon taxes for years. Didn't stop your forest fires. I know. Now and the guy who said that is not a bad guy. So basic education is important, but if we had an inner cabinet, and if I were Prime Minister, I would invite Trudeau, Scheer, Singh, even Max, to sit on an inner cabinet. Because if you make decisions together, given that this is an existential threat, and it won't be easy. And Churchill had Lord Halifax. I can put up with Andrew Scheer. So this work is going to be hard, but if we make it partisan, we will fail. That's why we have failed since 1992. Has been, I mean, John Chrétien, I don't want to walk you all through it. I'll just give you one example because it comes to mind right away. In 1992 at the Earth Summit, and I was there, and Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, and we made good pledges. By 1993, we had an election. I voted Liberal, even though I thought Mulroney had done a good job on the environment, but I'd never been a member of his party, but I did work in that government. It was set that aside. I believed Jean Chrétien's Red Book, which said that while Mulroney was pledging that Canada would hold to 1990 levels, that they wouldn't rise by the year 2000, Chrétien promised in the Red Book that we would reduce by 20% below 1990 levels by 2005. A 20% reduction by 2005. I voted Liberal. And on such trivial, bad pieces of luck historically do we fail that Anne McClellan won by 17 votes in Edmonton. And Jean Chrétien ripped up all the parts of the Red Book that were about climate action, went to northern Alberta, gave the Alberta government $3 billion to help start the oil sands. They weren't happening yet because oil was selling for less than $30 a barrel, and you couldn't make money out of bitumen until it was $100 a barrel. And then 2 years later, they brought in all the accelerated capital cost allowances. If not for partisan politics, I bet Chrétien would have kept his pledge because it was doable, it was in his plan, and there was strong consensus from the progressive Conservatives, emphasis on the progressive, because they'd already set a target that was ambitious. It's just that the Liberal target was more ambitious. So I can walk through this, and I can see election after election where I voted for what I thought was going to be the best choice for the environment and for climate action. That's why I ended up joining the Green Party, and thought this is hopeless with the old parties. The only thing that's going to work, and now this is where I'm positive about how we get them to work together, is in a minority parliament, as long as there are enough Greens elected, we go back to the story I started with, Lester B. Pearson and a handful of New Democrats, and we make transformational change. And we can get people to work together. If a province wants to opt out and commit itself to not only being on the wrong side of history, but being immoral and criminally irresponsible, they can do that because there's enough federal powers available to meet the targets. And the local orders of government, cities and small towns, not to mention Canadians as citizens engaged in this, can do more. And when everybody's called together and you see Rotary clubs competing with each other, I'm a Rotarian, so I think Rotary clubs can do a lot. If you asked every Rotary club in Canada, how many trees do you think you can plant? Bet you anything that Rotary clubs near each other start being competitive about who can plant more trees. The global goal of getting rid of TB. We're getting rid of polio globally as Rotarians. It's a huge goal. Rotary is global, so maybe then if we're planting trees in Canada, we get Rotarians globally to do it. I mean, this is an all hands on deck moment anywhere. I don't think if we can't get Doug Ford to be cooperative, and I have to admit, there's challenges there, then you work around him. Yeah. You work around that government. You work with the City of Toronto. You work with Guelph. You work with volunteers. You work with till they finally realize they're outnumbered, and they're outnumbered by their own voters. And this begins to look like a bad strategy even to them. So that's my approach: is togetherness till it hurts.
So I wanted to finish up on a few notes. It is overwhelming, this whole climate change problem. It's an existential threat, and the numbers are real, and they're not negotiable. Of course, I'd love you to work on my campaign. I'd love you to work on any of the Green campaigns in Manitoba. And there's people at the back who can sign you up. You can take a vote pledge, you can get a sign, you can volunteer. But there's so much.
Give money.
Oh, and you can donate as well. I'm sorry. You can donate to the campaign. I'm terrible at fundraising.
Clearly.
But, and it's needed. It is absolutely needed. I will not minimize that at all.
Thank you.
Like I often point to Elizabeth when I go to the door. I say, you know, Elizabeth May. Yes, they know Elizabeth May at the door because that's how popular she is. And I'm aiming for about half of what she can do because that will make me an extraordinary politician if I'm so lucky to be elected on September 10th. There is much more than that. It's about working together with other parties. Elizabeth was named Parliamentarian of the Year, hardest working parliamentarian, by her colleagues in the Parliament. And they didn't do that out of pity or anything. They did it because she won the respect of her colleagues, and she was able to pass a bill on Lyme disease prevention and awareness in the Harper government in 2014. Things are possible. Speaking of Mission Possible. Not only that, we have to work across party lines, and we are in BC right now, despite the NDP government's tax breaks to LNG. Anyway, I won't get too partisan. We also need you to get out to the climate strike on September 27th. Students, yeah, there are students. Oh, you've got leaflets here? Someone has leaflets for the climate strike on the 27th. This isn't, and not only do we need all parties on board, every one of you is in this, and you've heard it, and you can't say you don't know. So you have an obligation. I'm sorry to give this to you, but you have an obligation to do something. And there's obviously voting is important. Please vote. Volunteer for campaigns with the Green Party, and encourage, if you're with another party, that's cool too, but encourage them to do better because they have to do better. But get out and talk to your politicians, even if you're nonpartisan. Get out on the streets, get to the legislature, get to Parliament, and make it happen. The students are counting on us. The students that go to those climate strikes, I've been to several of them, they probably can't even find the words to describe how they feel about what we've done and what we've left them. So make a showing for them as well. And I invite you to, of course, vote Green on September 10th and volunteer, but do something about it. Take some sort of action. There's a lot to do, and we can't do it alone in the Green Party or in our government. So thank you all for coming. Speaking of cake, there's...
When were you speaking of cake?
Or is that back at the office? Anyway, oh, it is here, isn't it? Yeah, speaking of cake, my lovely wife Laura has made cake, if you want some. And thank you again. The people at the back are there to help you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to the West End Commons.
And I'll be back to collect more of your votes before October 21st. But for now, elect Dave Nickarz and Wolseley and shake up the country. Woohoo!